Tell us a little bit about your project and how it relates to the overall project of the aggressor.
My project's focusing on the role of aggressor in a transcontinental sense and also looking at the role of empire in understanding how we look at different aggressors. I'm looking at Cecil Rhodes, and Cecil Rhodes wasn't, in a traditional sense, a military figure. He was an industrialist, he was a businessman, he was an opportunist more than anything. And his imprint is felt very strongly, not just in South Africa, modern day Zimbabwe, which was, of course, titled Rhodesia, but also in the United Kingdom. And what I'm really interested in is this idea of the culture wars and battles over history. Choosing Cecil Rhodes, what I'm wanting to think about is this concept of the aggressor, but in very different circumstances in terms of the way in which South Africa considers its post-colonial past and the way in which Rhodes resonates as a controversial figure in the birth of a post-colonial nation. And in the United Kingdom, it's more about this sense that Rhodes has an imprint on Britain reconsidering its own legacies as a colonial aggressor.
Could you please briefly introduce the figure of Cecil Rhodes a bit more?
He was a mining magnate, but he was also a colonial aggressor. He was instrumental not only in the expansion of British influence across Southern Africa through extortion, exploitation, through military pressure, but also that he was a significant political figure in South Africa. He's emblematic in many ways of that British dominance, but also that he has a huge imprint on colonial history. And Rhodes is associated with a legacy of violence, of exploitation, and of persecution. In the modern sense about aggressor, we think about conflict, we think about war, and yet in the 21st century, what is increasingly clear is that we have significant business figures that have set up, particularly in the tech space, huge multinational companies that are having a huge imprint on global international relations, on conflict, and on politics more widely. And for some, it may well be seen to be a new phenomenon. And I would argue that Rhodes highlights the fact that there were those figures in the 19th century that, in different ways, had that same kind of imprint on global politics and on international relations. They were themselves aggressors in different ways.
This distinction between aggressor figures, like military aggressor figures versus business aggressor figures. And what would you say is like the difference in this portrayal?
As a businessman, his record may well have been no more controversial than many other, businessmen in the late 19th century. Many of the actions he undertook were very much in line with a common view about how colonial or imperial business should be undertaken. It is the fact that he has that military dimension to him which shifts and makes his legacy more contentious. And I think that what we've seen across the so-called British world is that there's a real connectivity between debates that are happening in countries such as Australia, Canada, and the United States and South Africa about settler colonization and their legacies, and those debates about colonization, the experience of colonization that we see in Africa, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, in India and Pakistan, and in the Caribbean. And the intersection between those two debates is often overlooked. Post-colonial revisionism is typically seen in very national terms, and so it's understood within those contexts. And yet, I think that the experience of Rhodes as an aggressor highlights that they intersect and they are connected in very powerful ways. But that doesn't mean to say that they produce the same results. These connected conceptual framings of the way in which aggressors influence national, European, and colonial history doesn't mean to say that the outcomes of debates in different countries will produce the same kind of debates or indeed the same kind of political responses.